Welcome everybody to our inaugural 2021 IRES seminar. Good to see everyone here. I see lots of people are still loading on, but I will start with the land acknowledgement. This is a student-run session, so maybe in the future we can discuss students doing the intro too. But most importantly, right now, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are on remotely, at least, UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus, which is situated on the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. And I'd also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far. And so to please acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. I should now turn things over to our first speaker, but again, welcome everyone. Looks like a good semester of speakers.
Okay, so gives me great pleasure to introduce Ian Theaker. Ian just defended his thesis about a month ago, Ian, early December, I think. And he worked on performance benchmarking for green buildings, how you present information to potential buyers in terms of whether some sort of communication about energy and climate performance factors into decision making when people make condo purchases. Ian is an old hand at green buildings. He's worked for a long time, an engineer by training. He has worked for LEED and for a whole host of green projects in Ontario and BC. He's currently on a boat in Vancouver Island. And so there's a bit of a worry that he might lose his internet connection. So if that happens, we'll figure out a way. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah.
You can. Good. Excellent. I'm going to share my screen now. And while I do that, I want to, there we are. Good stuff. Can people see my my title screen now?
I can.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yes.
So greetings from the unceded waters of the Tsuut'ina Nation, just north of Victoria. We're just getting a little bit of sunshine here after a really stormy night. So I did my master's, an MA thesis on building performance benchmarking data, particularly focused on condominium buyers. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Stand by. I'm just trying to make sure that I can advance here. Here we go. So this is a sort of outline of my talk. I'm going to say why I went for this. Talk about my methodology, literature review, my findings, some conclusions and recommendations, and thanks. And then if I'm real fast, maybe less than time for Q&A. So why do we care? Well, there's an awful lot of Canadians that live in apartments, particularly, and of course, in our largest metropolitan centers. 1.6 million apartments across Canada, and that was almost a decade ago. And those apartments emit a lot of greenhouse gases, some 12 odd million tons in 2013, many more now. And this kind of emissions and energy consumption can be affected. City of Toronto study in 2011 indicated really serious savings are available, both in electricity and fuels, and of course in greenhouse gas emissions. But there is very low awareness of of the environmental impacts of buildings in general throughout society. And so here's one place where an information intervention might really make a difference. So, like all of people in IRES, I bet that you're going through a very seriously interdisciplinary literature review. I mean, our topics tend to cover an awful lot of ground, and that certainly was the case for me. It led me on a merry chase through a bunch of topics that I hadn't really explored before, particularly behavioral economics, consumer decision-making, marketing, and market transformation policy. So, benchmarking. Well, it largely started really globally in the EU. The EU in 2002 brought in its Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, and it required energy certification of public buildings and dwellings in particular by 2006, and required all its member states to implement that. And they required that the people who were buying or leasing a space can get an energy performance certificate at the time of transaction. The implementation of it was definitely trouble. I mean, not all member states were in the position to be able to do it well. There weren't common standards for a bunch of things. And so it got revised, recast in 2010, very seriously, including adding now multifamily buildings, most commercial buildings. It required verification of the data quality, and broad public information campaigns to really get the word out. But in particular, it required that real estate advertising had to include some kind of energy performance indicator. And so this was communicated using an energy performance certificate. This is the UK's, each member state had its own, but you can see there's a bunch of elements for it. It's actually, this is the first page of 4, but in particular, you can see here that the energy efficiency rating and the score thereof, and putting it in terms of costs for dwellings, and with the number of recommendations that people could take to actually improve their performance. They specifically went to a particular set of metrics, a way to measure performance. And the explicit aim was to inform buyers and tenants and transactions to transform real estate markets. And so the design of the of the energy performance certificate, the graphic, is very similar to that for appliances and et cetera, and vehicles across the EU. So it's a common visual take on these things. In particular, the energy performance certificates are asset ratings. They're based on the modeled total energy cost of the building itself, not of the energy consumed by the people using the building. In the UK, they've got displayed energy certificates as well that are operational ratings, and they're based on the annual CO2 emissions of the measured energy consumption for the building. That's a crucial difference that I'll come back to in a bit. So how's it worked? Well, since 2010, they're showing that there are indeed price premiums for dwellings that have got higher EPC ratings. So if it performs better, it pays better. And it's being rewarded in the market, right across the EU. And this has been demonstrated by a number of different studies, quite a few now, using hedonic pricing regression analyses. And one really interesting study was done by Denmark. It was ready to go. Recast EPBD was implemented, and so the data set of sales of dwelling units sort of spanned the introduction of Denmark's having the EPC and the performance ratings shown in real estate advertisements, and it showed that there was very definitely a tie between those two. In the UK and in North America, most of the developments it's happened very differently. For one thing, it's coming up from mostly cities and states, not nationally or internationally, in case the EU. In Canada, you can see that that Ontario now has an energy and water resource benchmarking regulation, but it's most major cities, California and Washington, that are really the leaders in this. In Ontario, it's in the EWRB regulation, came in 2017. It was largely prompted by activism by the Canada Green Building Council Toronto, which I was a part of, and the Toronto Atmospheric Fund. And so Toronto Atmospheric Fund and City of Toronto led public consultations, and which were joined by the province in 2014. And the province eventually introduced legislation for it in 2017. But the legislation and the regulation were very different. There's a fair bit of regulatory drift in the crafting of the legislation, largely driven by lobbying by the Ontario and Toronto's Building Owners and Managers Association. There's been a lot of interest in BC with benchmarking, particularly by City of Vancouver, Richmond, the Lower Mainland municipalities. The Union of BC Municipalities actually called for the province to bring in benchmarking in 2014, and it's now labeling building energy labeling, particularly for homes, has been mentioned by Clean BC, and they're starting to work towards that. But again, there is opposition, particularly by the Building Owners and Managers Association of BC, and so we'll see how that plays out. Across North America, Energy Star Portfolio Manager is the tool that's pretty much universally used for benchmarking. It's become the de facto standard. It's run by the US EPA and was threatened by Trump, but it seems that now that Trump is gone, it's probably going to stick around, though maybe a little bit crippled by low funding performance. But it's based upon the actual operational performance, actual measured bills. But how this information, the performance data, is made available to the public by the cities, states, etc., varies all over the map, and what information they actually release to the public also varies pretty widely. In particular, the performance metrics for Energy Star and Portfolio Manager, it was originally designed not for benchmarking for the general public, but for owners and managers large for building portfolios. And so it's based upon source energy use intensity and an Energy Star score that runs from 0 to 100. That Energy Star score, that 0 to 100, the score within that, refers to the building's performance standing relative to a smaller database of buildings by Commercial Building Energy Conservation Survey. In Canada, a different database. But the point is that these are separate, nominally statistically valid databases that are nowhere near the scope of the Energy Star benchmarking regulations that have been brought out since. We've actually now a lot more Energy Star Portfolio Manager data that's available than is available in these databases, and that's problematic. So it led me to a big research question. What information do buyers want that would actually improve a market return for residential condos with high energy and GHG performance? And of course, that's a question for 30,000 feet. If they had to break that down into several secondary research questions. First, the people, home buyers, want to know, are there particular points in the search process when information might really be useful? Where do they get information about condos that they want to buy and homes they want to buy? And what metrics might really be useful to them? What might they prefer? And does it differ at different decision points? And just presenting this information in different ways, it make any difference? Do they want a history? Is it comparisons to others? Should it be scores, etc.? Does that make any difference at different decision points? And finally, given this, this age, are people concerned about the privacy of having this, the issues of benchmark performance of their homes, their consumption or emission made public to the world? So I focused, market transformation, it's all about people. And particularly, for me as an engineer, I'm used to more technical things. This was this broke a lot of new ground for me. So it really was an education. And of course, being an engineer, I have to make it far more complicated. This is a process diagram of just how people actually search for a home, and it's broken down into the top layer. That's the home buyer, the property inspector, the lender, the appraiser, the buyer's real estate agent, the seller's real estate agent, and the seller. And it goes from the beginning of while I'm thinking about it to, oh, gee, let's cut a deal. And so it points out to me particular places that information might really be important. The decision on whether or not to visit a condo, and what kind of purchase offer you might make on a particular condo, and some particular resources that are going to be really important in terms of conveying this information. And that's primarily the multiple listing service listings. So as you can see, a home search process is not an easy, simple thing. It actually involves a whole bunch of high risk decisions, and most people, this is the most money they're ever going to spend. It requires multi-stages. It requires a lot of involvement. It requires, it doesn't, a lot of people don't have a lot of information when they're going into it. It requires rapid decision-making, particularly when you're deciding if you're going to visit a place, or in some cases, particularly in hot markets, whether or not you're going to make an offer and how big an offer that might be. And whenever you've got those kinds of fast system one decisions, then people use heuristics to reduce the amount of effort but these often introduce bias. They tend to base information on what they already know or that's easily available. They tend to break down their criteria for things that I must have or the things that I must avoid. And once those are satisfied, then I'll look deeper. Or they may anchor, on any particular criterion. They may anchor on existing knowledge and that they're already familiar with, and not necessarily pay attention to things that might be different.
You have 5 minutes.
Yeah. So I took a really fast grounded theory approach, starting with realtor interviews, an online survey, and interviews, and of course literature review goes on all the time. I'll just skip by the realtor interviews because frankly, they didn't tell me nowhere near as complex as that. People operate from emotion. So I did an online buyer surveys because I was hoping that I could get enough respondents for a statistical analysis. This was in Toronto over December 2016, and it was a 15-minute online survey. It did reach saturation with my month. Here's the first set of findings that, in fact, people do want information on the performance of their buildings, particularly energy and cost performance. So energy cost, energy consumption. The most important things, of course, are what's the purchase price, what are the number of bedrooms, etc. People weren't very educated. I knew about that, so I gave them several different infographics to sort of give them a bit of education, and I tested their preferences for both aspects and criteria before and after viewing these graphics. So here again, this is what people find important in terms of performance metrics before and after seeing those graphics. Again, energy costs are what almost all of people wanted. Their consumption, yeah, that was of some interest, maybe a score. Energy use intensity, very similar. The GHG emissions, yeah, maybe 60%. It was nowhere near as important to people as the energy costs. So I interviewed 8 of those buyers to get deeper, get some more qualitative information. All of them definitely wanted to know more about energy costs in particular. Most were interested in GHG performance, especially the younger people. They wanted both simple and detailed performance data on buildings. All of the people I interviewed wanted to use that data to help with their negotiations. They conflated poor energy or GHG performance with poor construction quality or bad building management. But very few thought that the transparency of performance information would really impact prices a lot. And it was really interesting. There aren't very many people very concerned about whether or not their benchmark consumption data was going to be made public. Here's some of the comments. There were only a couple of the people that interviewed, or for that matter, surveyed, that were really concerned about it. So my conclusions: everybody wants to know about their building's energy performance, especially about costs. Many are also interested in the greenhouse gas performance, but energy cost across Canada does not communicate greenhouse gas performance. So it implies that if you're going to, for policy purposes, you're going to be using benchmarking to be driving down climate emissions, then you're going to have to use another indicator to communicate with people. And the place to do that is in their home buyer search decisions, particularly when they're looking at the MLS listings and in the negotiations. And you're requiring that the performance metrics are carried in the performance listing in MLS listings is probably going to be essential. That's certainly the European experience. But in terms of the data presentation, there's a lot more research needed at this point. So a bunch of recommendations. First, be very explicit in your legislation language. make sure that you actually identify your primary policy goals are climate, or reducing energy and cost, and state the intent for real estate market transformation, and that you're looking to inform home buyer decisions with the benchmark data, and communicate that to the home buyers with standardized ways of measuring them, and make sure that they're through MLS listings. And the lead here has got to be the provinces. They've got the jurisdiction over energy issues, so they're the ones that would be bringing in benchmarking legislation. It'd be good for them to fund and coordinate local support for owners and managers by real estate stakeholders, typically ENGOs or building own trade associations, etc. But the provinces should be the ones that have the central database that is interoperable and easily transfers that information to the MLS web portals. And they should be reporting annually and making that data sets open to the public. There's a federal government role here as well. Natural Resources Canada really is already playing a national coordination role, but there's a few things that they could do to make this a lot faster to implement. First, develop the model legislation language. And second, lead the R&D into ways to present this information into the metrics and graphics, make sure it's compatible globally with reporting standards like SASB, GRI, etc. Make sure that it's easily interoperable, and host a national database as well, so that data is available to all. So, thanks, Ray Cole. Melinda, we're my advisors on this. Thank you very much, Melinda. I don't think Ray's here. Jiaying Zhao and David Boyd. I do see David is here. We're on my committee. And the City of Toronto provided incentives to get the gift cards. And I did a bunch of other research for the City of Vancouver, Jennifer Wall and Sean Pander on their benchmarking efforts. And finally, my wife. So. Thank you, folks. I'm done. I'm not sure where my time is. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That was great. I think we have a few minutes, but Melinda, were you going to field the questions there?
Yeah, can you unshare the screen?
Yes, I can. Sorry.
So
I don't think I think I have. Is it shared?
It is unshared.
it's unshared. Okay.
It's
good.
unshared, and people can use the chat too, of course.
Yeah. Okay. As is our protocol here, questions from students first. I see one hand up, Nigel. Nigel Deans.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Kandekar. And thanks for the presentation, Ian. That was excellent. It's always cool to see people incorporate behavioral measures and cognitive biases. And so my question's related to that. It seemed like the effect sizes you got were pretty small, and what you were asking for was people's perception of what they would do, of their purchase that they would make on a Likert type scale. Am I correct in that?
Actually, the number of questions. I generally used a 5-point Likert scale. I asked if people would value this information in that particular case, and so
okay.
how much they might value. Okay.
I wonder if you came across.
I did ask some questions, after that about how they might use the information.
Awesome. I was wondering if in the literature you came across anything about implicit measures that could substitute for those subjective measures, where you could have people say demonstrate that they would find the information useful in some way by applying it to a decision, or if you could actually see if it would affect their decision to buy a house, for example. Is there anything like that?
No, I didn't really. I did ask them whether or not how it might affect their housing purchase decision, and got mostly qualitative answers about that, saying, yeah, it would help me with negotiations. I wouldn't look at poor performing buildings, etc. I considered using kind of a budget method, a hedonic pricing method, but I thought that frankly I had way too much already in the survey. I had to throw away about probably 40% of my questions that I initially had to try to keep it down to 15 minutes. And even then, my average time, I felt pretty proud. It was about 18 minutes. So.
Okay, that makes sense.
I don't see any other hands up.
Oh, you're letting me off easy. Thank you. Bye, folks.
Thank you, Ian. And I'm glad that we didn't have an internet connection mishap.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll hand it over to Terry now.
And who is introducing our second speaker?
I am.
Okay, thanks, Sean. I should have
No
assumed as
problem.
much.
Hello all.
Hello, Sandeep.
Yes. Hi all. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Hisham Zarifi, and I'm an associate professor in forest resources management and one of the associates on the faculty at IRES, where I've supervised a number of both master's and PhD students. And it's great to see such a great turnout for these student seminars. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Sandeep. I'm going to keep my introduction as short as possible to give him as much time as possible to present. Sandeep came to UBC with undergraduate degrees in engineering and a graduate degree in environmental science and policy from the Erasmus Mundi program. But also very interestingly, Sandeep had a career as a journalist covering energy issues in India prior to going for his master's degree. As I think you'll see in this presentation today, has turned that experience to his advantage in his data collection for the particular chapter he's going to present. Sandeep more broadly has been trying to unpack a number of questions around what we call just transition. So that is the issue of what's going to happen around fossil fuel workers in particular as the energy system moves from a fossil fuel based one to a more renewables based one in the context of action on climate change. And so he's done a number of interesting pieces around looking at the realities around the possibility of fossil fuel workers moving towards renewable jobs and what those relative jobs numbers might look like and spatially and over time, as well as doing a systematic review of the literature on just transitions and what it says and where the gaps are. And then today he'll present on his work that's more specifically drilling down to thinking about this in the context of India. So with that, I'll pass it on to Sandeep.
Thank you very much, Hisham. I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay. I hope you can see me and hear me.
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to present this. This is sort of my last chapter of my thesis, core chapter, I mean. Before I really get into India and talk about just transitions and what it means in the Indian context, let me just broadly sort of talk about what is just transition and why should we really care about it. And then I will get into India. Then I will talk about my chapter or the study, and then very briefly, describe the future work that perhaps needs to be done in the Indian context. So like Hisham was saying, like very briefly, like lots of people have different frames of what just transition look like, what just transition means. But in the context of climate change and energy systems transition, what we are really asking is like what will happen to the future of workers, communities, dependent regions as these regions move away from fossil fuels. And this is sort of a global problem. Wherever there are fossil fuels, especially the production of fossil fuels, you will have this kind of question. And so many people will ask, why should we care? Like, historically, so many industries have declined. What's the big deal? Like, sure, we have other pressing issues to take care of. So one argument which applies to historic cases also is sort of like thinking about it from a justice point of view, that you don't want to leave anybody behind. And this concept and the idea of just transition has now really reached, various organizations, including the Paris Climate Accord, where just transition was sort of it was part of the Paris Climate Accord, and the World Bank and various organizations have come up with various reports and strategies on what a just transition should look like. So one is the justice argument, but the second is really a political argument. So for many people who argue about just transition, it's a practical or a political counter to people who support the continuation of fossil fuel industries or coal industries, and when they do that, they basically sort of promise the continuation of industry because it will help keep those jobs and revenues and so on and so forth. And so, I mean, US President Trump's case is very well known and cited in the literature, but there are cases around the world. I mean, Australian Prime Minister brought a lump of coal in the parliament and so on. There's so many stories of how they talk about continuing these jobs. But more broadly and from an action point of view, these just transition strategies or sort of conversations have now reached government policy making, and many governments have formulated just transition commissions coming out with policies, and so a lot of action is happening at national and subnational levels as well. So we did I'm just going to very briefly just talk about, we did a systematic review to understand, and specifically focusing on just transition for fossil fuel workers and regions. And so it's a new field. It's a post-Paris Agreement field in the academic world, although there's lots of policy reports. And most of the studies are basically focused on OECD countries. And so there is a large gap in understanding what it means in the context of, let's say, countries like India, even South Africa, and various others. So with this whole, sort of the big picture context, I come to India, and I sort of thought, let me explore this question in the context of India. So again, very briefly, India is the second largest producer and consumer of coal. So India's coal trajectory is quite crucial in meeting climate targets. It has a very young fleet of power plants. So its average age is 16 years. For comparison, I think power plants in US are like 40 years old and so on. Per capita consumption is very low, and so future demand is expected to be really high. So what this means is that coal is still growing very slowly now, but renewables are expanding rapidly. So government has really ambitious targets for achieving renewable expansion, but at the same time, they are not talking about sort of like, first of all, like, pausing the growth of coal and then eventually declining it. However, within academia and in the policy research space within India, there are two sort of broad debates about coal transition. One, that basically very techno-economic, least cost or cost-effective proposals for shutting down inefficient and old power plants. So in that context, a just transition, and these papers are missing any just transition analysis that focuses on coal communities around, these power plants and mines. And then the second is sort of now a growing debate about, okay, what does a just transition look like in a context, in a country like India, and how does it play out in the medium and long term when actually coal starts to decline? So my sort of the India study really looks at long term, but it's one of those first studies which does a baseline understanding of what is at scale, what are we really talking about. So I basically did two things here. I quantified the scale of current socioeconomic dependency on coal at a district level. The reason I did this is right now the whole narrative is about jobs transition. So it seems that jobs is a proxy for just transition, which while jobs are really important, but you will see that jobs is one of the many aspects when we think about fossil fuel regions or coal transition regions. The second is once sort of provide a comparative assessment of districts. So this study was done at a district level, which is sort of like the sub-administrative level, let's say a county equivalent. I don't know if that's a fair comparison, but something on that like. So with a small area, an area within the state. So before I get into my study, I have to acknowledge, I have traveled to many of the coal bearing areas and written a lot of stories. I mean, there are serious health and environmental impacts beyond climate change, beyond emissions and so on. So I mean, there's serious subsidence issues in most of these areas as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before I get into quantifying what coal industry provides. So this study was basically done in 3 stages. First was to kind of understand, okay, what are the different layers of coal industry's contributions or socioeconomic ties in India? And then, collect and quantify some of the indicators. So we came up with some indicators based on this conceptualization, and then try to quantify those indicators. And then created like a coal dependency index, comparative index between districts, and also a district dependency profile, which is basically high dependency, low, medium, or no dependency. So one interesting thing is when I was, while starting to do the conceptualization work, I mean, one thing that is really interesting about India is that it's dominated by government-owned companies. So coal mining, Coal India Limited, which is the world's single largest coal mining company, owns, or produces about 80% of Indian coal. It has 7-8 subsidiaries, and they basically are spread around 5-7 states, and they produce the bulk of coal. Again, coal transportation is done by Indian Railways, more than 50%, and there are private truckers as well. And then again, in power sector, the power plant sector, even state-owned companies like NTPC and others, state government-owned companies own like almost 55% of the installed capacity. And most of these all are also funded by state banks, companies like Power Finance Corporation and so on. So based on reviewing annual reports of these companies and my own experience, and talking to some people informally and sort of like reviewing the literature, I came up with this kind of holistic picture of the different ties. So if you look at the box on your left, the contributions are for the government, the railways, and CSR. And so in India, CSR is mandatory corporate social responsibility. 2% of any company's profit has to go in CSR in local regions where they have to operate. So coal companies and power companies contribute to different kinds of layers of federal, state, and district revenues spent on CSR. And in fact, Indian Railways, there was an interesting study that Indian Railways 40-45% of entire freight revenue comes from coal, and which is what they subsidize the passenger segment. In terms of the jobs and pensions, so the second box, there are direct jobs, of course, people working in mines and power plants, and then there are indirect jobs in the supply chain, induced jobs of people who rely on spending of indirect and direct workers. And then there is an informal category, which I will come to in a minute. And then there are pensioners. There's a large number of coal pensioners who rely on the continuation of the coal industry. In fact, there are more coal pensioners than coal miners in India. Then the last category is sort of the industrial fuel. There's lots of informal ways in which these companies operate, provide free electricity to people living in coal-bearing areas as part of their social contract. People also scavenge coal and use it as a household fuel. So coming to the district, which is the unit of my analysis. So there are 4 categories. Again, it's an extension of the national picture. So there are jobs that I talked about. Then there are district revenues, one major being district mineral fund, but they also pay different kinds of district taxes, CSR. And then the discretionary funds. So Coal India runs 500 hospitals and schools and so on. In fact, the company is spending $7 billion every year, which is almost the budget of the top social security scheme, National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So That's the scale we are talking about. And then it's of course an industrial fuel and so on, which I explained. One thing that I'm not able to do in this study, and I think it's sort of a big limitation, is the informal jobs. So there are lots of people in these coal bearing area, especially in the mining space, who scavenge coal, and basically after scavenging coal, typically the male member of the family goes and sells this coal in the market. And if you travel to some of the eastern Indian states like Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, you will see these sites of people basically collecting and putting all this coal in a bicycle and walking it up a hill 60-70 kilometers and really earning very little money. So this is one area where I have not been able to quantify, and I think that is something a future study should perhaps look at. So there are so many layers. So because there are core cycle walas and such an informal economy exists, there are motorcycle walas who are pulling this coal cycle walas. And wala is basically somebody's sort of profession. So you say chai wala, so somebody selling tea. And so, and then this motorcycle wala will pull the coal cycle wala and charge 100 rupees or two Canadian dollars and so on. So that's the sort of way in which all this informal sector operates. So coming to the data collection, what I did is basically I needed to quantify jobs, pensions, revenue, and so on. So I filed Right to Information, which is the Freedom of Information, India's Freedom of Information Act requests. And after months and months of these application, I finally got all the information I needed. Although what was missing, I found in some of the annual reports of all these different companies, coal ministry, power ministry, and so on. I was also provided some data from recognized coal industry unions. And then I used for power plants, Global Energy Monitors dataset. So this is how the data was coming under RTI. It was like some scanned copies of this data and that all scattered. So then I had to collect all that and compile, and then sort of clean it up and then put it in like district level format. So what does it mean at different district levels? So just briefly some results. What we find is that coal sector spillover effects is in 284 districts with varying levels of dependency. India has 700 something districts now. It keeps changing every year. So that's it. But of course, not some of these districts have very little. And so, but anyway, so we looked at direct and indirect jobs, and they are in coal mines and power plants, and they are in 159 districts, about 3.8 million jobs. Coal pensioners are in 199 districts, about 500,000 pensioners, and basically their pensions are tied to continuation of the coal industry. And companies have collectively spent 144 million. This is a conservative estimate because I did not account for those companies who are also, let's say they are in power as well as steel sector. So I've only looked at companies whose main business is power and mining. And then district mineral fund was collected in 52 districts, almost $500 million. So this is sort of the district level quantification. There is of course a large variation. Some districts, so just for comparison, looking at two districts at the opposite ends of the spectrum. So Korba in Chhattisgarh, if you see a district with 1.22 million people, 15 mines, 120 million ton production, 2 gigawatts of power plant capacity, almost 380K jobs, little CSR, district mineral fund high. But if you look at the other Tinsukia, it's small. It's a small sort of like the footprint is small compared to the other one.
5 minutes remaining.
Okay, great. So I am not showing you all the results, but this is one result of districts with over $5 million sort of like US dollars collection, which the local government is collecting. So this is I think 22 or 23 districts. and they span basically many districts in central and eastern India. Similarly, CSR. And these districts are spending like these districts have seen something between something over $1 million CSR spending in the last year. And very briefly, CSR spending is meant to be for healthcare, education, and so on and so forth, and those kinds of developmental areas. And so then once I had all the indicators and the values, I combined them, and I basically, used one of the methodology of Acharya and Porwal, where they were normalized, ranked, percentiles were calculated, weighted, and then scores were added together. And then so this is sort of the list of top 25 districts in the sample. Uh, what we see is that Jharkhand state, which is one of the large coal producing states, has 8 districts out of the top 25. Then there is Chhattisgarh, and then Orissa, and so on and so forth. One thing is that this is only a district level quantification. States also get a lot of revenues from coal, so that it does not show, because some of that money comes back to the districts or even from the federal government. So this doesn't show that. So just very briefly, some sort of like thinking about India and what could be some of the agenda for future work. So one thing is that this is a new field. So my sense is that it's important to zoom in on some of these districts and conduct both quant and quantitative studies to understand what are the risks and resilience. Sometimes it's really hard to capture the real, like the full story just based on numbers. There's lots of intangible connections. There's a coal as an identity issue and things like that, which is sort of hard to quantify here. Then I think the informal jobs is sort of like a really big area where I think now many people are thinking about ways to explore and try to understand how to address the informal side of these things. And then the other big sort of like, I think something that is missing in this study is what is the socio-economic implications of coal-based industries? So steel, cement, and so on. A lot of times these industries are co-located, so they'll be very close to the mines or power plants and so on. So they may amplify some of these socioeconomic numbers, so to say. So it's, I think future studies could sort of look at that and try to incorporate that. And the last piece is that given that it's such a state-owned enterprise type coal transition that we are looking at, I think it's absolutely critical that companies like Coal India or NTPC diversify, and they are taking a lot of steps in that direction. But if they diversify, I think they have a lot of social contract in these regions, I think, which sort of is really important. And I think that's, in my opinion, that's a very important just transition element going forward. So thank you. I am really thankful to Hisham for all his support and to my committee. And I'm really grateful for Public Scholars Initiative for funding my study and basically this research. So thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sandeep. Much appreciated. Thank you for that presentation. And we are now open for questions. As Milind said, the standard is for students to ask questions first. And so please use the raise hand function or put your questions in the chat. And so we already actually have a question from a student, Ian, who asks in the chat, is the LCOE or levelized cost of electricity to consumers now cheaper for renewables than for coal generation across India?
Oh, I don't know about across India. I mean, I have to go back and look, but I think that in many places, yes. I think generally, yes. That's my answer to that question. But I think many people have this question about like whether LCOE is the right parameter given, it perhaps doesn't count for the time of the day and things like that.
Right. Yeah, and Emily knows it is hard to quantify the price of power in India given the state-owned enterprises along the chain, as well as, of course, the price that the consumers face is different than the cost. So the next question I see is from Rocio.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Sandeep, for your presentation. I was wondering, and I'm sorry if you already mentioned this, from the national budget of India, do you know how much coal like inputs in, right? So if you're looking at transitions, that would be like a big gamble for the government. Yeah.
So I don't think it's a very big deal at the national level, but it's a very big deal at the regional level. So I think it's something like 3% of the national, I think it's tax, I have to go back and look, but something like 3% of the revenue collection or something. So it's not a very big story at the national level, but when you go down to 7 or 8 states, or let's say 5 or 6 states, then it becomes a bigger story. So state of Jharkhand, I think, has 10 or 15% of state on top of the district, the state revenue collection.
Our next question comes from Juan Martinez.
Hi, Sandeep. Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting topic. I wanted to ask about, like in terms of the time frame. I know there's like climate commitments, but there's also probably modeling based on the current prices of renewables on like what the pace of replacement of these industries will be. Is India in for like a faster paced transition, or do you know, like, can you speak to that a bit?
So let me start with the policy, like where the policy is headed for that. It's a very good, interesting question. So I think right now the strategy is double down on both coal and renewables. Of course, the coal market is not, it's difficult. There is resistance and so on. Government has massive renewable targets. There's no question about it. Like, and so far in this decade, they have done really well. But whether that will continue has its own set of challenges. But that I don't think coal is going down, or there is no plan to. I think it'll go through 3 phases. Right now, the growth of coal has slowed down a little. The next phase will be sort of, it will become like flat, and then it'll start to decline. So this is the last phase, I would say, of any new capacity addition, maybe the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. And then it'll kind of, but it's, I don't know, it's hard to predict what is going to happen. In India, one thing is that policy changes every year, every month there is something. There's so many things going on in terms of sort of like where everything is going.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. We have another question.
Sorry, can I just,
please?
Can I follow up briefly?
Yes.
So just to recap, so right now there's just no transition. There's just growth in jobs of both coal and renewables. Okay.
So interesting. So it's an interesting question whether there's growth in jobs. The point is that it's also mechanizing. So there is some drop in jobs, but those are direct jobs. I don't think it's impacting the other, the supply chain or other. But in terms of direct jobs, it's kind of, like the systems are becoming efficient. But yeah, generally both are growing.
All right, I'm trying to keep track between the between the chat and the hands up take the questions in the proper order. So I think the next one was Ramzi, who asks whether consider that state ownership of coal-related companies may be an advantage towards environmental policy implementation for just transitions. Right. So this is a question we've talked about before about whether state-owned companies can have some ability to do the transition better than private-owned companies because they're state-owned.
Yeah, I mean, they have some social obligation. Like they cannot, like unions are strong, they're well represented. So I think they have a social contract. They have some much more social obligation than, let's say, any private company in India, at least in the Indian context. So I certainly think that they are in a much better position in terms of just transition. They cannot fire anybody. They have to do certain things that private sector may or may not do. For example, if they kind of take away land for coal mining, they have to provide jobs and things like that. So I think that the historic track record, I'm not saying they're great, but like comparatively, they're much better than, I would say, any private sector in India.
Okay.
So yes,
I just
they
want
are
to keep an eye on our second student question there. Harold has had his hand up for a while, and then Kai's had his hand up, and Malin's in the chat.
Yep. That's exactly the order. That's exactly the order I have on my list.
Thanks, Jean.
So Harold is next. Yeah, I think you're muted.
Harold, you're mute. Harold, do you want to type your question into the chat and we can pick it up in a second? We're having trouble hearing you.
Yeah, I think so why don't we do this? Harold, if you could type your question into the chat, and while you're doing that, I'll flip over to Kai to ask his question, if that's okay.
Great, thank you, Sandeep. That was really interesting. Following on Juan Diego's question, I was wondering, actually I have two quick questions. I was wondering why you chose just transitions framing for the problem if it's not a transitions problem. And then secondly, I was interested to hear a little bit more about the normalization and whether you were trying to maintain the kind of difference in magnitude, or whether you went in the normalization to a kind of like percentile ranked list, and if so, why you did that as opposed to maintaining the emphasis on magnitude, where some regions might be much more prone to these kinds of risks because they're in absolute terms much more dependent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that question. I think the first question about why I chose a just transition framing. So I think there's two reasons for this. From a policy point of view, I think this debate is growing in India. And the debate itself is framing it as just transition. Because now, 2 years, 3 years ago, nobody was talking about any transition in India. But now, many, including Central Electricity Authority and various agencies, are talking about transition and just transition. So that is one motivation. The second motivation is actually people are doing analysis, including governments are looking at questions like, can we shut down inefficient power plants and inefficient mines? There's lots of inefficient mines and power plants. So if you do that, then for the short term, this becomes a question for those communities. So that I think is my answer to why I chose this. The second question about, I think we have both the absolute numbers, but also the normalized numbers. So is that what you asked? I'm not sure if I got that.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the value of trying to combine the multiple different dimensions of reliance, but my suggestion would be to do that in a way that you still maintain something about the relative difference rather than going straight to a ranked list, and in a way that emphasizes the outliers on the high side and doesn't emphasize the outliers on the low side.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think we also do this kind of like high, low, and medium profile based on comparing different districts. So we divide into different quadrants and sort of look at what are the high values and for each indicator, but also kind of combined.
We can talk about this offline, but we go back to some of our conversations. We've had these conversations. You've done it both. You've done it the way Kai has talked about, and we have sort of both sets of results in the chapter, if I'm not mistaken. Right. The question of which one gets emphasized and which one gets into an appendix, and the rankings end up being the same, but the absolute magnitudes, of course, change. Harold, are you able to? We're out of time, unfortunately. I think. So we have two last questions for Sandeep, I think, to think about. And maybe get back to the individual questioners by email. So one is about science communication. How do we communicate our findings to the public, given that your work could be used to motivate keeping coal in power, which is an interesting question. And then Malin has a question about the fact that coal mining and power generation is in regions with high proportion of indigenous populations. Groups have been profoundly marginalized by India's caste system, abhorrent caste system. What do we know about their well-being in coal regions vis-a-vis other regions? I think two excellent questions that we unfortunately are out of time for. So I will, with that, I will urge you, Sandeep, to think about those questions, maybe get back to the questioners offline and turn it back to Terry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sandeep and Ian both. And, you know, we might be able to go over a little more in the future, but I'd be curious just to, even if you send it an email, your response to Harold's question would be great to hear. And I'll send you Malin's from the chat, okay? All right, see you later, everyone. Have a good week.
Well,
Bye, everyone. Great to see you. Have a good week.